And can you just confirm that you're all looking at a title slide,
Yes.
not the note slide?
Yes, that's what I'm seeing, Sarah.
Okay, great. So tonight I'm going to be talking about how bears learn to live with us, which I think is a pretty important topic right now. Bears are waking up and we're already starting to see bears in the media a little bit with people encountering them on the landscape. So thank you very much for joining me this evening. I'll just tell you a little bit about myself before we get started, but I want to take a little bit of a step back to kind of set the stage. Anytime that we have an interaction with a wild animal, we come to that interaction with all of our preconceived notions and expectations of how that's going to go. Our relationship with nature and wild animals starts from the moment we go outside. As April mentioned, I grew up in Alberta and I spent my childhood recreating in Alberta's parks. Me and my family knew that bears were there and we often took efforts not to run into them. My mom used to buy me a can of Coke to get me to the top of the hike, which was always such a treat because my parents were pretty big health nuts. The second treat was that when I finished the Coke, I could put rocks in the can and shake it all the way to the top. That tells the bears you're coming, my mom would say. Fast forward to my adult life, and I had always believed I should never want to encounter a bear because they are dangerous and could hurt me. And while that's true for sure, it's definitely not that simple. Over the years, I've come to learn that bears are so much more than scary stories told in the newspaper or fluffy teddy bears from TV. My master's work showed me that bears didn't always want to run away from people. My PhD taught me that how bears selected habitat around people depends on many different things, but mostly depends on the individual bear. Throughout my research, I have learned that regardless of where you are and what bear population you're working with, the human experience is an essential part of the encounter. Coexistence is defined by us, how we perceive the risk and outcomes of these encounters. Tonight, I'm going to share with you some of the science behind how bears learn and discuss what that means for their ability and willingness to coexist with us. I'll invite you to consider coexistence from the bear's perspective and then think about what that might mean for you and how you use the landscape. Even though this talk is really about bears, we wouldn't be having this talk at all if it wasn't for people. When I first became a bear biologist, I thought I'd be working with bears all the time, and how wrong I was. As usual, bears showed me that my assumptions weren't always correct, and I frequently come back to these words of wisdom from one of my master's supervisors, that wildlife management is usually just as much people management. If we are going to effectively manage for human-bear coexistence, we need to consider that we will in effect be managing people. Rarely do we manage bears directly. It's ironic because we often think of managing wildlife because of what we as people need. But really, if we want to manage for what we need to think about managing ourselves. Throughout my research, I became more and more aware of the individual variation within bears. This idea that bears had personalities. It could be reflected in my data, but it was also something I witnessed every day. Over my years working with bears, I had become very aware of their personalities, events that had happened to them that predisposed them to act in a certain way. These things could not be reflected with data points. This is important for us to remember in any bear encounter. The bear's response to that encounter, even the fact that it is using habitat near people, is at least partially based on the many experiences that bear has had previously, experiences that you can't know when looking at that bear. Working for the Alberta government, I had to create plans based on what I thought most bears would do, but I knew that I could never address all of the things that bears do. I began to think about what bears had taught me and how that shaped my perceptions of them on the landscape. Also, during my time away from research, I began to think as a recreationist again. I began to watch other people's interactions with bears or listen to other people's stories. I began to understand how the things that bears had taught me through my research framed my expectations of every encounter I had, but other people hadn't been taught those same things by the bears. I wanted to share what bears had taught me, not just the science behind my research and that of countless other researchers before and after me, but what they had taught me about who they were and who I am when I'm with them. I pitched this idea to John Marriott, who some of you may know. I was like, my text, your pictures, awesome meets awesome. It wasn't a hard sell. John and I met over a decade ago when I first moved to Canmore, and over that time we've worked on a few different projects together. All of those projects have been about communicating bear conservation issues or influencing habitat management to protect bear access to high quality habitat. What I like about working with John is that we're on the same page. We both value bears and their right to exist in a landscape where they are free to access the foods they like without people getting in the way. We both believe that people can take actions to improve the human-bear relationship, and that it's easier to ask people to cut down a crabapple tree in their yard than it is to ask a bear not to eat delicious crab apples. Over the years, we've gotten to know each other's families. We hang out, we philosophize, we share meals, and sometimes we even talk about things other than bears. He's a good friend, and I'm really lucky to do a project like this with him. We're a bear dream team. Joking, not joking. All of the photos in this slideshow tonight are John's, and all of them are also included in What Bears Teach Us. So you can get a sense of what our book is like. So what is our book about? Well, as a scientist, I value data, and there's a ton of research about bear behavior and habitat use that the average person may not have access to. Through my work and my play, I have been blessed to spend hour upon hour with bears, watching them, writing down what they're doing, and trying to understand why they do what they do. I've been elated, mystified, scared, curious, surprised, inspired, and nervous. When I think about it, a lot of what I have learned about bears and from them come from my own personal bear stories. But it's hard to describe what it's like to look into those deep brown eyes. How could I possibly put into words the depth of emotion and decision-making that I see when I look into a bear's eyes? That's why I needed John. Our book weaves the science of bear behavior with stories from the field, with John's amazing photos to bring you North America's bears in a way that maybe you've never seen them before. I want to share a little blurb. I'm going to do some readings from the book throughout the talk tonight. So this is the first one. This is the only photo of a bear in this presentation that is not John's. This is the very first grizzly bear I saw close up. The first time I looked into the deep brown eyes of a grizzly bear, I think I stopped breathing. For a moment, all was still. I was doing something I had been told never to do. I was sitting mere meters away from one of North America's largest carnivores, looking him right in the eyes. He looked back at me with a lazy, quizzical expression. A lazy strand of water dripped from his lips as he munched on long blades of sedge grass from the estuary shore. I just stared. Thoughts raced through my mind. What would happen now? What would he do? What would I do? Was this safe? This was crazy. Nobody should be this close to a bear. What am I even doing here? I was stranded in space and time, unable to move and unable to speak. But then I exhaled and relaxed. The bear just kept chewing grass as if he didn't even care I was there. I could hear his tongue and saliva processing the grass and swallowing it. I could hear him breathing. Even though I was in a small Zodiac boat with several other people, in that moment, it was just me and this big, beautiful bear. His eyes were soft, quiet, and relaxed. I was not confronted by the vicious man-eating carnivore I had grown up to believe grizzly bears were. Although he was massive with long claws and long teeth, I felt no fear, just wonder and a little confusion. Was everything I assumed to be true about bears wrong? So here in North America, we have three kinds of bears, which you may already know: black grizzly bears and polar bears. And all of these bears live in different places and are adapted to live in their environments in different ways. Black bears more commonly live in forested ecosystems. So for example, they have shorter claws, which makes it easier for them to climb trees. Polar bears have an array of adaptations to live in the Arctic, including how their fur is made basically to retain heat and keep them warm. And of course, grizzly bears have that huge shoulder hump that's quite characteristic which evolved from digging up things on the plains. All bears have experienced range contraction due to various human events and development. They all have a few things in common, even though they're quite different in a lot of ways. They all hibernate and give birth in the den. The length of hibernation depends on if they are giving birth or have cubs with them, especially for polar bears. Male bears will try and kill cubs to bring a female back into estrus so that she can mate again. And that's one of the reasons why a mama bear is so fierce. She's evolved to protect her cubs from a male, and she'll fight to the death if she has to. Our relationship with bears has changed over time, from bears being persecuted to being a source of entertainment, to defining us versus them spaces, to coexistence. Arguably, we're still in the paradigm shift towards coexistence. We have work to do, but we're definitely getting there. There was a time when people wrongly assumed that humans were the only beings capable of complex thought, decision-making, and learning. Some people still believe that animals operate mainly on instinct, but recent research has really just begun to scrape the surface of understanding how bears learn. I kind of feel like when I think about bears' ability to learn, it's like this photo of this polar bear in this massive ice field. Like, we know looking at this photo that the ice field is so much bigger than the actual photo has been able to capture. And that's kind of what we know about how bears learn. I'm going to read every moment of every day, a bear makes a decision based on its learning or the present circumstances and its estimation of what may happen next. The ability to learn is associated with large brain size, well-developed memory, behavioral plasticity, and curiosity. Bears have all these characteristics and are capable of weighing stimuli to make decisions about their behavior in the moment. Their memory and behavioral plasticity enable them to learn from the past, and their decision-making skills enable them to live in the present. There's a few different ways that bears learn. I'm not sure that the mechanisms are that important, but I'll share them with you. So all animals can learn through experience, especially if that experience is life-saving. So for example, a vole learns to stay under the snow during the winter time because that's the best place to avoid getting eaten by a hawk or an owl. Some of these behaviors then get passed on genetically through natural selection, and those behaviors then become instinct. Some behaviors just result from a lucky escape, and if they don't happen often enough or in meaningful ways, they may not ever get passed down genetically. And then, of course, there are other examples of active learning where an individual just learns from other individuals or from other people on its landscape, I guess. It can be hard to distinguish between the type of learning without several generations of behavioral data, and that's why I say I'm not sure it's so important how an animal learns, but it is important for us to appreciate that there is learning happening. Learning from the mom for bears is critical. So bears spend the first few years of their lives learning as much as possible from their mother. For these first years, they'll spend 24/7 with her, watching her, mimicking her, and absorbing all that she has to teach. Most lessons focus on what to eat, where and when to find it, and how to stay safe. These years are essential to provide social learning in a productive setting. And social learning refers to knowledge acquired by watching, copying, and emulating behavior. So you'll see quite a few pictures in the slideshow tonight of a mother actually teaching her cubs how to fish or whatever. All right, I have another reading for you. Okay. I started my work in the Kutsumateen and the Northwest rainforest, and so this story is from the Kutsumateen. Along the shorelines of the coastal rainforest, bears get a protein boost from a variety of sea life during the spring before the salmon arrive. In the Kutsumateen Inlet, some grizzly bears are particularly fond of razorback clams. I spent several hours in the still waters of the morning watching one subadult female methodically walking the low tide shoreline, sniffing the sand, Once she got a scent of a clam, she would dig a little hole, scoop the unsuspecting clam out, lean it against the pad of one of her front paws, and with the other front paw, she would use the tip of one of her claws to pry the clam open. She would then lift the open shell to her mouth and suck the clam out. The shells were rarely broken throughout this process. Once done, she would take 2 steps over and repeat the process with a new clam. I marveled at her dexterity and efficiency. During my work in the Kuzmatine, there were 2 matriarchal females in the inlet, both of whom had 2 3-year-old cubs. These females taught their cubs many things while I conducted my research, silently floating in my small boat. One female, Blondie, regularly spent the low tide patiently teaching her cubs how to dig up clams. She would walk along the freshly exposed sandy beach, sniffing the air and sand. Once she got a scent of a clam, she would stop and sniff again to discern the precise location of the clam. Her cubs would run to her side and do the same. They would sniff the sand, look at their mom, and sniff the sand some more. Once satisfied they had the scent, Mom proceeded to dig a precise hole and scoop the clam out. The cubs would mimic her every move, paying very close attention to what she was doing. She would then pry the clam shell open and slurp the soft-bodied clam from its productive casing, and the cubs would do the same. While it was fascinating to watch, what really fascinated me was how Lucy, the other female, never put any effort into clamming. Her preferred seafood were mussels growing on logs adjacent to the shore that were exposed at low tide. She would teach her cubs to swim and wade along the shoreline away from the beach to find and eat exposed mussels growing on ancient waterlogged cedars. Lucy had never learned how to be a good clammer, and Blondie had not learned to take advantage of the mussels. These 2 distinct foraging patterns were passed down through the generations, and once the cubs were independent, we sometimes hypothesized their maternal lineage partly by how and what they ate during the spring. Of course, foraging patterns are never enough to definitively say which subadults came from which female, but it did contribute to the list of characteristics that we use to define individuals. Females don't only teach their cubs what to eat and how to eat it, they also teach the cubs the lay of the land, so to speak. This map shows the seasonal home ranges of a female grizzly bear in Banff National Park. Through years of following their mom around, cubs will develop this map and understand where food can be found during different seasons. They will also learn where the human developments are, such as roads, trails, and communities. Landscape elevation, easy mountain passes to cross between valleys, and even areas to shelter from other more dominant bears or other threats will end up in their mind map. A mother will teach her cubs where on this map the best berry patches are or where the best fishing spots on a stream are. I'm just gonna close this curtain. I'm getting a little blinded by the light. Well, that didn't do it. Okay, that's better. Bears that absorb these important lessons will eat more, gain more weight, and be healthier going into hibernation. Bears will base their movements across the landscape on their internal understanding of their home range. It is these important lessons that make translocating bears out of their home range risky business. They haven't learned where the good berry patches are, and research shows that translocated bears actually have increased rates of traveling and decreased rates of foraging for several years after translocation. Research out of southern Alberta has also shown that bear habitat selection is a behavior taught to bears by their mother. So these few years that they have with their mom in their early life is pretty important for them to get a sense of where the good berry patches are, really, or good fishing spots. Not everything a bear learns is from its mother, though. Some things are learned just by gaining an understanding of the landscape and the different food options available. Grizzly bears in Yellowstone switch the focus of their diet from trout to elk calves to false truffles based on what is more readily available. This means that a bear's mind map probably contains areas with grade A and grade B foods. So being flexible in what they eat is an essential component of their resiliency to change. Bears also learn from people. especially in areas where human-bear interactions are more common. Bears incorporate roads and human use trails in their mind map to understand where and when human activity is more prevalent and how to avoid it. The crossing structures in Alberta's Bow Valley and in Banff National Park have become shining examples of how bears learn. Both the overpasses and underpasses are used by bears, but that success didn't happen overnight. It took several years for bears to learn that the crossing structures were a safe way to cross the highway and that they could use them frequently. Although they will use both overpasses and underpasses, bears definitely prefer the overpasses. Grizzly bears in particular have increased use of these crossing structures over time, displaying a learning response to overpass use. I'll just read another excerpt here. If females rear their cubs in the wild, away from human development, their cubs are likely to retain that habitat preference and stay in the wild. Conversely, if females rear their cubs in developed areas, they have a higher chance of becoming food conditioned, which is basically a dependency on human food. These bears become food conditioned through social learning, largely because of the habitat type they were raised in. Food conditioned mothers raised food conditioned cubs. Although some wild bears did find their way to communities and human food on their own, this was rare. Cubs that were food conditioned were also 5.6 times more likely to be killed because of their association with developed areas than cubs of wild mother bears. Every decision that every bear makes is based on a culmination of its past experiences, lessons learned from its mother, and its personality. We have a hard time predicting what an individual bear will do because we rarely know what it has been through. One thing we do know is that bears learn and they remember, so events from their past will influence their present. They are, however, also capable of changing their daily behavior based on new information. They can switch what they eat if their preferred food source isn't available. They learn and grow and change, and over time they become individual bears with their own patterns of behavior. Understanding how bears learn and how they adapt their habitat use to what they know about the contents of their home range can help us better coexist with bears. A big part of what we can do is to be as predictable as possible. The predictability of human use is essential for coexistence. Predictable human use patterns reduce bears' stress levels and consequent avoidance or defensive behaviors. Basically, when people are predictable on the landscape, the reduced stress levels allow bears to conserve energy and continue to exploit high-quality habitat near people. In these cases, it can be good for a bear to be habituated to people because they can still eat near human development. Non-habituated individuals may attempt to avoid human use by exploiting these habitats at night. So it's important for human use to be as predictable in space and time and type. So what we do is important. So for example, if it's a hiking trail and all of a sudden you're mountain biking or quadding and bears don't expect that, that could be, that reduces your predictability of use. Where we do it is also important. If we stick to designated trails or trails where human use is more prominent, then bears know where the human use is happening on the landscape. And when we do it is also important. It is really important that bears have a human-free window on the landscape overnight, early morning, and at dusk, where there is no human activity. So those less habituated or less tolerant bears can still access important habitat without having to deal with people. One of the keys to coexistence is being predictable. Assimilate, conform, and stop going off trail and looking for that unique selfie. Those are words I never thought I would hear myself say for sure. When bears have the chance to decide whether to be around people, we reduce the chance of a surprise encounter and causing the bear to react defensively. Got another, let me just find it here. Sorry, there it is. In Alaska, the highest quality habitats are typically occupied by male grizzly bears, which have a higher position in the population's social hierarchy. And females with cubs are sometimes displaced to suboptimal habitats to avoid infanticidal males. Research at bear viewing sites has shown how bears consider high quality habitat, both in terms of the type of food available and when during the day it is best accessed. Bears perceive their habitat spatially in terms of their home range and temporally in terms of hours in the day, weeks in a season, or months in a year. Within this context, research has found that females with cubs increase their use of salmon streams during times when humans are active, suggesting they perceive humans as a lower risk when compared to the threat associated with large males. Similar patterns have been observed in Alberta, where females use habitat closer to human use features than males do. When females with cubs used a salmon stream when people were absent, their energy intake decreased by 37% because they were constantly on the lookout for males. These same females displayed no change in foraging behavior when humans were the only threat present. In these cases, habituated females can increase their foraging success by taking refuge from large males in areas of human use. In bear viewing sites in Alaska and BC, this can be managed by restricting human use to very predictable parameters, such as time of day, length of viewing time, number of people, etc. This allows wildlife managers to create times when people are not present, thereby providing time for less tolerant bears to fish in peace. A varied but predictable human use pattern throughout the day and seasons allows all bears, regardless of their level of habituation or tolerance, to access a rich food source at a time that works best for them. In human-dominated landscapes like Alberta, human use is less predictable and bears are less tolerant. Even in protected areas of the Bull Valley, people can hike on any trail at any time in any group size. There are very few times when people are not active. One of the most challenging aspects of my PhD was trying to create a human use model that would consistently predict human use levels on trails. While I could say that people are more likely to hike on trails closer to town on a sunny weekend day, those may not be predictable patterns from a bear's perspective. So at the end of the day, I really think that coexistence works when we work together, not just when we work together as a community, but also when we work together with bears. And understanding how they learn, how they move around the landscape, and what their priorities are a pretty essential part of coexistence. Here in the Bull Valley, we're pretty good at human-bear coexistence. We have a lot of bear-proof garbage bins for waste. We have centralized garbage pickup. We have bylaws about compost and dog food outside and attractant management. And all of these things are really important to help bears understand that when they do come into town, there's nothing for them here. And so there's no point in them being here and they can carry on. We also have multi-jurisdictional collaborations between government agencies who develop these coexistence working groups that really look at how bears move through the landscape between the national parks and the provincial parks and public land, and putting programs in place that really look at the bigger picture. And all of those pieces are really important for coexistence too. But I also think that coexistence lies with each of us as individuals. Every single time we go and recreate on a trail, we make decisions that either contribute to coexistence or potentially harm coexistence. So it's really important, like I said, for us to have a predictability of human use. That means sticking to designated trails, having dogs on leash, listening to area closures or trail travel restrictions that are in place. But it also means sometimes thinking about bears before we think of ourselves. So I often will go online and look to see if there's any bear sightings on a specific trail that I want to walk on. And if there is, I'll just go somewhere else. If the bear is accessing that habitat right now, well, I can go and use another trail. So coexistence is really about sometimes putting the onus on us to change our behaviors to make life easier for the bear, if that makes any sense. One thing I've learned throughout all of this is that a bear is not just a bear. Sometimes they're silly and sometimes they stare at you with daggers in their eyes. Sometimes bears make sure you know who's boss, and other times they don't even care if you're there. Research shows us that bears are individual, and so does personal experience. Research can help us understand how bears use habitat and what is important to them as they make daily decisions about where to be, what to eat, and who to be around. Experience can help us understand the personalities of each bear, even if we only see them once. Look at the two bears in these two photos. This is the whole reason why I wanted to partner with John on this book. When you look at the black bear on the right, you can tell he's annoyed. His hackles are up, he's staring intently, he even has a furrow in his brow. The bear on the left doesn't care about you at all. At the end of the day, what bears have taught me is just to be yourself. And don't be afraid to make it clear how you feel. I wrote this book to help people think about their relationship with bears and maybe to see them a little differently when they encounter them or hear other people speak of them. Bears, just like nature as a whole, have a lot to teach us. We just have to sit still long enough to listen. And with that, I will say thank you very much for having me. I wish we could have done this in person. Darn COVID getting in the way of my good time. You can get your copy of What Bears Teach Us at Cafe Books here in town, or the Canmore Library has a few copies, or you can email me because I actually have 10 in my house right now and I'm happy to sell you one. Or you can also order it through Rocky Mountain Books or on Amazon or anywhere that you buy books. Thank you so much for your time this evening, and there's plenty of time for questions. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'll put my contact information in the chat, and yeah, we can just have a discussion if you like.
Okay, you're welcome to turn your screens on. If anyone has any question this evening that they'd like to ask Sarah, please go ahead.
I just put all my contact information in the chat, so if you want that, you can just copy and paste that from there.
Great, thank you, Sarah. We'll just see if anyone has any questions this evening.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes,
yeah,
we sure can.
Definitely.
Perfect. Hi, Sarah. We have your book. We bought it at Cafe Books, but we haven't got. Yes, it's very good. We haven't got too far through it, so maybe you've answered this question in the book or not. Just in your talk, you mentioned the way Canmore's done a lot of great things, you know, bear-proof garbage bins, rules about compost, etc. So they say there's no food here, so they don't come into town. But what about all the wonderful deer and elk that are here, including the baby elk? They're in town. Is that not a great food source for them?
It is. In parts of the province, elk calves and moose calves in the spring are a significant portion of bear diet, especially grizzly bears. And of course, we're all aware that there are instances of grizzly bears killing calves on ranch lands in the springtime. It really depends on the habitat type. Bears kind of need a little bit more open, flat space to successfully hunt calves. The elk that are calving in Canmore, in and around Canmore, tend to pick areas that are not super accessible for carnivores, which is why they pick them, right? Okay. So as far as I know, the elk calves and moose calves are not a huge source of diet for grizzly bears in the Bow Valley. Like I say all of this with the huge caveat that if a bear has an opportunity to eat a calf, he or she's going to take it. Like, so it's not as significant a source of their spring diet as it is in other parts of the province, but definitely in some parts of the province, it is a much more significant source of nutrition in the spring.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sarah. We've got a question from Kylie, Sarah. Kylie in the chat. Did you want to read that?
Yeah, so Kylie says, I'm curious on your thoughts on bears and photography in the parks. I did my dissertation on photography and its impact on wildlife, bear welfare, and probably unsurprisingly, there's an impact. That said, I do think photographs have value in education too, like you and John have shown with your book. Do you think it's possible to facilitate viewings, photography of bears in a way that's safe for humans and animals? And if so, how? This is a pretty complex question, Kylie. Thank you so much for asking it. It's a really good one. It's super relevant to how we interact with bears in the Bow Valley and in the national parks. So yeah, there is an impact of photography. And one of the reasons why I like to work with John is that his lenses are humongous. And John and I went out into the field several times to write this book together and to get photos that we could match to stories in the book. And we typically were much farther away from bears when he was photographing them than when I was researching bears in the Kootzmatine. So I think that there's a lot of technology that enables people to get really great photos at a very conservative distance, thus reducing impact to bears. And so I really encourage photographers to seek that out. I was also part of a group where we're looking at the last Banff Park Management Plan and the Bow Valley Parkway Action Plan. And photographers really came together to talk about how they were going to come out and take photos and what time of day, and really starting to think about how as photographers and how as an industry they could work together to reduce their impact and to provide that predictability of human use in a way that would reduce their impact to bears, that would still provide bears the space that they needed to access resources. I do think it's possible to facilitate viewings and photography of bears in a way that's safe for people. The key component of that is, again, this predictability of human use. So when you look at areas that are like really known for photographing bears, like McNeil River up in Alaska or Brooks Falls in Alaska, where you have like 60 grizzly bears congregating on the same waterfall fishing salmon. That is like the ultimate for predictability of human use, because there's like a viewing platform. People are only allowed to walk on a specific boardwalk. They go to the viewing platform. They're only there for X number of minutes, and the group size is only, it's less than 10 people, I believe. So it's really predictable. And the closer that we can get to that level of predictability, the safer we can have a viewing experience. Here in the Bow Valley, that's a little more challenging because we don't have an area where all of the bears congregate in the same way. So our predictability is really around like, what is the human behavior at the roadside when there is a bear jam? What do we do with bear jams? How many people are allowed to stop? Are people staying in their vehicles? All of those things are important. I think the other thing is that there's a big difference between photographers who are making a living doing photography and have proper equipment and big lenses, and somebody who's trying to take a selfie with their bear on their phone. And how that's managed and the level of risk and the safety requirements, I think, are very different. That was a very long-winded answer, but hopefully that kind of fleshes that out.
Thank you, Sarah. Another question we have on chat is, what are your thoughts on how sunrise sunset hikes are becoming more and more popular? It would definitely affect the predictability aspect.
Yeah, I'm not a fan. Like, I get it. Sunrise and sunset hikes are beautiful, right? I mean, it is pretty nice to be on top of a mountain and watching the sunrise or the sunset. But that is a really active, like that's a time for bears to be really active on trails and in habitat during dawn and dusk. And so I'm not a huge fan of the sunrise sunset hike trend. My PhD research showed that grizzly bears were less likely to use a human use trail after, oh my gosh, 8 human events since dawn. So if everybody's on the trail since before dawn because they're hiking up in the dark, then they basically have really impacted grizzly bears from being able to use that trail to move through that area for the rest of the day. And that, I think, can be quite problematic over the long term.
Thank you. And Stephen has a question. comment and question, but are dogs used there in aversive conditioning? And a friend did that years ago in Whistler.
Yeah, so we used to use Karelian bear dogs in Kananaskis for aversive conditioning. That program isn't running anymore. It has had great success in Kananaskis country and also in Montana and other areas. It really comes down to a capacity issue and a funding issue, to be honest. But the thing with aversive conditioning is that it really needs to be applied consistently to be effective. So there isn't really an end point. Like, you're kind of training bears to avoid human use areas by chasing them with dogs. When they get close to the campground or close to the roadside, you kind of chase them off with dogs. If anybody has tried to train a dog or a cat to do anything, you know that the importance of consistency, you have to be on it all the time. Like, every time that bear comes to the campground, the dogs have to be there to chase it away. And that consistency is really challenging just from a human capacity perspective. And you run the risk of it turning into bear sitting, where you're basically just following a bear around the landscape, trying to chase it out of areas where it might come into contact with people. And that gets pretty costly, but it also, I think that it runs the risk of taking the onus off of people to coexist with bears, and it builds this expectation that a park managing agency or a land managing agency is actually just running around chasing bears to make sure that they don't get into trouble. So it kind of takes the responsibility off of us.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who has a question they'd like to ask Sarah this evening?
I'm sorry if you guys can hear my family. My office borders the kitchen, so I'm sorry if that's gotten a little bit loud. Hopefully I've been louder than that.
I might have a question if we have a few minutes. So I'm a big fan of Charlie Russell. I've read all his books, and I think he did a great book with bears. And like, he says that most of the issue is like the fear we have in bears, you know, because like for 200 years, human has created legend around this animal, and that's our biggest issue right now. And what do you think we can do, and do we actually do enough to demystify, you know, the fact that grizzly is seen as a predator?
Yeah, I also Charlie Russell is one of my role models, mentors. I mean, I'm really have been inspired by his work. And I think he's right. And I get a little bit more into that in the book, talking about like how our fear response in an encounter actually has a lot of influence on the outcome of that encounter and our expectation of how bears should be managed where we are. So are we doing enough? I mean, I think the best way to deal with fear is to recognize that it's okay to be afraid of bears. Like, they're humongous and they have big claws and big teeth, and it can be quite intimidating if you don't have a lot of experience with bears and you just suddenly come down a trail and there's a grizzly bear in front of you. Like, I feel afraid too. So I think the first, like for me, is to recognize that that's a pretty natural response to have as a person. I remember when I was doing my master's, this person I met asked me if because I was working with bears, I was less afraid of them. And I'm like, I don't know if it's less afraid or if I just have more respect for them. I very quickly learned that grizzly bear does what grizzly bear wants, and your responsibility on the landscape is to make sure that grizzly bear doesn't want you. If I can break it down as simply as that. So I still feel afraid. If I run into a bear unexpectedly, my instinct is to feel fear. But I don't allow that fear to influence what I think should happen next. And I think that that is part of what we can work with teaching people who recreate and live in and around bear habitat, is that the fear is okay. But we should also recognize that you know, there's a few things there. Like bears actually don't want to hang out with you either. And a bear is not automatically going to charge you and try to eat you the second it sees you. That we really benefit from slowing down and stopping and not running away or having a reaction or assuming that that bear is going to do anything, because really it probably isn't. And so I think that helping people to understand some basics of bear behavior can really also contribute to coexistence, and hopefully for people to feel a little more comfortable recreating inside and a little more confident that if they do run into a bear, it's not going to end badly for them. I hope that answers your question, Andy.
Yeah, thank you.
So there's another question here in the chat. I'm wondering if you could speak to how bears are responding to climate change. Do you think they're under stress at all? I haven't come across any research that really looks at bears and climate change specifically. I mean, there's quite a bit of research that's looking at how forests are going to change in response to climate change. And that is really a lot of bear habitat is in a forested landscape. So their habitats will be shifting and their food sources will be shifting. I'm not sure I know how to answer that question, if I'm honest. Yeah. Do I think bears are under stress at all from climate change? I'm not sure that it's their top stressor. So grizzly bears, especially, and black bears to a lesser extent, but in Alberta are living in a pretty high stress landscape already. They're trying to navigate a landscape that has a lot of human activity on it, and they're trying to find ways to not get into trouble with people. But also living in Alberta is subpar habitat already, just because it's not coastal and we don't have fish here. So I think that bears living in Alberta are already challenged by other things that are happening every day on the landscape. Then I'm not sure that climate change is compounding that stress, unless it creates severe weather events like the huge wildfire that was in Waterton a few years ago, or the flood of 2013, which probably wiped out some pretty significant habitats and things like that. So yeah, I haven't come across anything that speaks specifically to climate change in bears.
Does anyone else have another question for Sarah?
A second question from Kylie.
Yeah.
If there's time regarding fear in bears, what are your thoughts on the recent bear encounter in Waterton Lakes that's been in the news that focused mostly on the person's fear response? Do you think that kind of reporting could be damaging for bears? Yeah, absolutely. I was pretty upset about that, that news coverage of that encounter in Waterton for a couple of things. Like one, the headline was, I thought I was going to die. So when I read that headline, I think that bear has mauled that man and that there's been contact and that his life was in danger. And that's not actually what happened. So I find the headlines for some of these news articles, when they're really sensationalized like that, it just does bother me because it's not a true reflection of what happened. I have no doubt that the man felt that way in that encounter. It was obvious that he was quite afraid. And you know what, if I was hiking by myself and I turned around and there's a sow grizzly bear with 2 cubs behind me, like, yeah, I am not a fan of thinking about that situation. Like that can potentially be quite dangerous. But I also think that, so his fear is perfectly justifiable. But it's hard in the media to know what exactly happened. It sounds to me like the sow with cubs was walking on the trail and he was on the trail and he turned around and saw them and got afraid, and they still kept walking on the trail because that's where they were going. And that is becoming a more and more common encounter between hikers and bears, especially the more people we have hiking in bear habitat, the more often that's going to happen. Bears use our trails, our hiking trails, to navigate the landscape too. So it's pretty normal for that kind of encounter to happen. I think that it's a shame the way that that was reported, and I feel really I feel really bad for that guy that he was so afraid that he just sat on a mountaintop for 5 hours waiting to be rescued. I don't think that that's a comfortable situation for anybody. And actually, one of my friends who runs a bear education company has reached out to him and is going to give him some lessons about how to be in an encounter and some bear behavior kind of tips, just so that he can feel more confident when he's recreating outside. Yeah, it's a shame. And I get really annoyed when the media makes bear encounters really sensational and fear-mongering. I find that really problematic. And I'd probably do a whole webinar just on that.
Anyone else have a question?
I need to do more webinars. I have done quite a few since the book came out, I'm not gonna lie. But thank you very much, Jessica. And thank you, Glynis and Bill and Kylie, for your compliments. That's really fantastic.
And thank you from the Canmore Public Library. I want to thank you, Sarah, for being our special guest this evening. Thank you very much for an informative session. And again, Sarah's book is available for checkout at the Canmore Public Library and also for purchase. Sarah said she has 10 copies right in her house that she's willing to sell and available at Cafe Books. And John Marriott's photos are available on his website as well, if you're interested. And come and check out that book or purchase that book for yourself. And we really appreciate you all joining us this evening. Thank you very much for taking your time out of this lovely Canmore, beautiful, sunny night that we've had. And take care. And the Canmore Library is currently closed right now as mandated by the government, but we are offering curbside pickup. And we've got a lean machine going there, being able to offer books at our door. So give us a call. We'll help you find anything within our own library or outside of our area and bring it in for you. So again, thank you, Sarah, for your time this evening. And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you so much, everybody, for coming. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.